If you would like to earn CPE credit for listening to the show, visit earmarkcpe.com/FPA. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Finally, if you enjoy listening to FP&A today, please go to your podcast platform of choice, click the subscribe button, and leave a rating and review of the show. And now, on to the show.
From data rails, this is FP&A Today.
Welcome to FP&A Today. I'm your host, Glenn Hopper. Today on the show, I'm joined by Derek Paulson, Director of FP&A and Supply Planning at Rad Power Bikes. Derek's had a solid FP&A career from manufacturing finance at Honeywell to sales finance at PepsiCo, and now leading forecasting, pricing, and supply chain planning at one of the most well-known e-bike companies in the U.S. He describes himself as a generalist in finance clothing, which I love, and you'll hear why that mindset has helped him thrive across finance, marketing, and operations. We'll dig into how he models growth without historical data, balances strategy with day-to-day execution, and leads his team through uncertainty, tariffs, and transformation. So let's get into it. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here and honored to be selected for this. I'm a listener of the podcast, so nice to be invited.
That's great. Really enjoyed talking on the when we were talking ahead of the show. So I can't wait to kind of dig into to your background, and I think we share a lot of common approaches to finance. So I can't wait to get into some of those. So I guess for our audience, let's go ahead and start at the beginning and just kind of walk us through your career journey and what led you, and I guess even before that, what led you to finance in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the why finance is an important question, but I'll go back to as a little kid. As a young child, once I had an experience where I think it was my grandparents were telling me about when they were little, they could go out and buy a loaf of bread for 10 cents. And then that was kind of how I got first introduced to the concept of inflation. And for some reason that stuck with me. And it fascinated me so much that later, still in elementary school, at one point our teachers gave us a writing prompt that said, if I could go back in time using a time machine, I would ... The answer I ended up giving was I'd go back to Great Depression times, buy a bunch of loaves of bread and bring them back to current times and sell them at like a 10x profit. So even as a 9-year-old kid, I already had this idea of arbitrage in my mind, and there's a great arbitrage opportunity there. So I had that interest in business even from my young age. And as I got to college and I was deciding on a major, I knew I wanted to be something in business. And I landed on finance for really two key reasons. First was, I think it's a really good hard skill that becomes a foundation you can build a career on. And the second is really it kind of leaves a lot of options open. When you think about different industries, really FP&A can take on a lot of different flavors as you go throughout your career. And feedback I'd heard from mentors and from the career development program at college, I got that feedback a lot. And that's something that, as someone who at the time didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, and sometimes I still feel that way, finance was a really good way to say, hey, I'm going to leave some options open and see where my career takes me. And it definitely, I would say, you mentioned a little bit about my background going through Honeywell and PepsiCo, earning an MBA. I really do feel like I've been able to build a great career off of that foundation, and I'm really excited to see where it continues to head from here.
Yeah, and your career, I mean, you worked at some heavyweights like Honeywell and PepsiCo, and I think and I think we'll talk a little bit more about the training program at Honeywell. But I guess looking back at your time at those two companies, what were the biggest lessons from those roles? I mean, especially in terms of how FP&A partners with like sales and operations.
Yeah. So I did join Honeywell right after college, and I would say they definitely have a reputation for developing finance leaders and really focused on well-rounded financial professionals, not only understanding the nuts and bolts of finance, but also understanding the business. Talked a lot about the CFO as COO, and really wanted to emphasize within that company, CFO needs to be a business partner, and that trickles all the way down throughout the organization. So as an example of that, my very first role at Honeywell was in a manufacturing plant down in Mobile, Alabama, where they They made chemicals for all kinds of different end uses. And, it meant a lot to first role be doing cost accounting and CapEx planning at an actual site where the business actually gets done, where the products actually get made. And it was a great learning experience to just learn the nuts and bolts of the business. Later on, I had other opportunities to, be at a corporate FP&A role and get the more traditional annual plan, monthly forecasting, variance analysis, kind of FP&A cadence. But it was really kind of having that breadth of experience, as well as a focus on being a functional partner. That was kind of what I took away from Honeywell. After my stint there, I did go back to business school, and I'm happy to talk more about that decision. I assume it's probably of interest to a lot of listeners. But after business school, I joined PepsiCo. And what's funny is that they have a similar reputation to Honeywell, so much so that I was sitting in a recruiting pitch, and the PepsiCo recruiter was sharing an article that came from the Wall Street Journal about where future CFOs worked, and they highlighted that PepsiCo was one of 4 companies that's known for training future CFOs. And I was very familiar with that article because I heard the same pitch from Honeywell coming out of undergrad, because they were also one of the 4. So I joked for a while. I was like Thanos trying to collect Infinity Stones, and work at all 4 of these. I only got halfway there, but really a good, awesome learning opportunity. I think the PepsiCo learning for me was really 2 things related to how companies win. First of all is brands. So the power of brand as a differentiator for businesses. I saw that when I was, working on brands like Doritos, Pepsi, Mountain Dew. These are some of the most famous consumer brands out there, and really got to see the power of brand when you think about pricing and just, market share. It all comes back to brand. Secondarily, and one that I think I've carried into my future roles, is also the power of distribution. If you think about any of the places you've been in the last week, there's probably some Pepsi product that you've interacted with at multiple touch points. Convenience stores, restaurants, grocery stores. There are, Doritos on the shelves and Pepsi on the shelves, or at the beverage spots. So really seeing that the power of meeting your customers where they are and making it easy to see and discover your brand can be a really big differentiator for businesses. And that kind of feeds into where I am now at Rad Power Bikes, as I've gone through a little bit of a transformation as far as our distribution model.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly where I was going to go next. Is so at Rad Power Bikes, you're kind of focused, and you've helped transition the company from that direct to consumer e-commerce model to it. Now you are a true omni-channel business. So that is that distribution there that you were speaking of. And so I guess, with that in mind, can you talk us through what that transformation looked like? I mean, from a, from a financial planning and modeling perspective, primarily.
Yeah, definitely. And first I'll give a quick intro to Rad Power Bikes, because it's not as well known as some of those other brands. But, Rad Power Bikes is an e-bike company, and we're really all about changing the way transportation happens, making it more energy efficient, enjoyable, and accessible to all. So really focused on how do we change the future of transportation? And a lot of that is by, designing, building e-bikes that can be car replacements. They're also used for fun. I have 4 of them in my own garage. So I'm a consumer of our own products, but it's really kind of a bold vision. And that's what originally attracted me to the company. And a little bit of the history on us is, for the vast majority of Rad's history, we were a D2C e-commerce platform. We sell a bike in a box to someone, ship it to your house. You grab it and you build it at home. But as we found over time, more and more customers wanted to really test ride and see and feel the bike before they made such a big purchase. And so we really started to grow partnerships with local bike shops, where we'd sell to the bike shop at wholesale, and that bike shop, it would help you test ride and get the right fit and pick the right bike for you. So that was a big shift. If you think about not only strategically, but operationally and financially. You mentioned, the forecasting aspect, the shape of the P&L. If you think about a wholesale retail model, is very different from a D2C. At high level, wholesale products, you're going to get lower gross margin because you have a margin that you're granting to your partner. But you also assume and hope to see leverage on the SG&A side. May not cost as much from a marketing perspective to reach that customer. So the shape of that P&L is different. So when we were thinking about building this business on top of our existing business, we really thought about what are the P&Ls look like separately first. You think about the business levers that you can pull in these two different business models really necessitates two separate P&Ls. But then at the end, you got to bring those P&Ls together and make sure that the whole picture makes sense. You can assume that 1 + 1 = 3, but if you don't think about the impact that, selling at wholesale at a lower margin, maybe that cannibalizes a sale that you could have gotten at full price. So you have to really think about the blended P&L. And that's something that we have obviously learned more about over time. But, the key is, I think, to understand the business levers and then also think about strategically how those two pieces work together and make sure that it truly is 1 + 1 = 3 and not 1 + 1 = 1.5 or less.
Yeah. And when you do stuff like that, that was always my favorite kind of modeling to do. And it's funny. I had a finance professor years ago accuse me of confusing the map for the terrain, which is that saying is stuck with me forever because I just loved modeling so much. And just, you can think about all the assumptions and drivers and just build it layers and layers deep and have your, all your internal factors and your exogenous factors and your scenario analysis and all that. And it's, as doing FP&A, that's like the most fun I had and especially when you don't have a lot of historical data where you're just continuing a trend line, throwing in some seasonality and all that. But with you, the whole shift in the approach to the way that the bikes are distributed, I imagine you had to build similarly forecast and pricing models, and you didn't have the historical data to back it up. So how do you approach modeling when you're flying, really without a reliable baseline? It's all brand new.
Yeah, it was especially challenging for me coming from big established companies that have a lot of history. Forecasting something entirely new, starting with a blank Excel sheet, is daunting. But I actually also think that in some respects, it takes the pressure off a little bit because your forecast model is going to be wrong. You just know you can't get all these assumptions right when you have no history to base it on. And so in some respects, it takes the pressure off. I think what's key is identifying, as you mentioned, what are the key drivers that really impact the end result of this model. And the simple example is forecasting revenue for this brand new business. The wholesale channel. There's really identified. Just keep it simple. What are the 3 key levers that or kind of inputs that will impact your model most? First of all, is number of wholesale partners. If it's 1, if it's 100, if it's 1,000, obviously that's going to have a big play in your model. And then secondly is how much volume is each of these partners doing, and on a monthly basis in particular. If you sign up a partner and they do 100,000 in sales a month versus a partner that does 500,000 in sales, obviously has a big difference to the end result of the model as well. And we didn't really have a lot of data to make an estimation on, but you got to start somewhere, put a line in the sand and say, on an average basis, this is what we expect. And then the third piece is the actual margin rate. What margin are we granting to our partners? Say it's a 30% margin for modeling purposes, and so we keep 70% of that. You put that as an input and know that you'll have to tweak it over time as you learn more. And I think keeping it simple, focusing on the drivers is really what makes that model work, because you're going to have to adjust those drivers over time. Start it knowing that you're going to have to make those adjustments. And then once the actuals flow in, then you can tweak it and find out where you were wrong and make the adjustment.
Yeah, it's funny. I just was, we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Annette DeYoung, and she moved from accounting to finance. And one of the things we were talking about is the difference, from accounting and finance is finance. You can be okay with being directionally right. Whereas accounting, it's like, no, that, it is that the trial balance has to balance, period. That's, That's all it is. So that's a shift. And I also, it's funny because I come from a private equity backed business background where you know the, nobody wanted to see a model that was not as perfect as in maps exactly to the terrain. But I do going back to another professor's quote, the George Box quote that all models are wrong, some are useful, and that's something to keep in mind too. It's again the map is not the terrain, so that's a big part of finance. And if you can, as you get more data, like you said, you can tune them in. But if you're directionally right and you're strategically thinking about what those drivers are, what the levers you can pull and everything, then that's your job as a
Ye-
finance person.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. And at the end of the day, you as the forecaster are responsible for that forecast. And so when it inevitably is wrong, you have to be able to explain why it was wrong. And I think if you have the right levers identified there, that becomes easy. You can say, hey, it was, we expected 100 new partners. We only got 50. So that's why we fell 50% short of our forecast, right?
Yeah. And in your forecast, so you're now, I mean, you're forecasting revenue, you're doing the supply planning and even the marketing support. And I think about, that's more the, that talk about having to be strategic. You're looking at everything, and the cool thing is, it goes back to what you said initially about being a generalist in finance clothing. You're going across, but you see how each lever impacts the other. So I'm wondering, how do you balance the responsibilities across all three and kind of maintain that clarity across such interconnected roles?
Yeah, one of the beauties about this career transition I've made, going from those big kind of well-oiled machines to a true startup, is I get to wear a lot of different hats, and I actually really like that. That's been rewarding and inspiring for me in my career. And I will also say that doesn't work without a good team of specialists, that are supporting me and supporting me in that decision making. But yeah, it is a lot of responsibility, a lot of roles that aren't usually combined into one. But that's, as I mentioned, kind of driven by my personality, that the persona I've taken on of being a generalist in finance clothing, that's really what keeps me excited about work. A lot of times within companies, what causes friction or inefficiency is when different functions don't talk to each other well. We see it. I'm kind of straddling the finance and marketing world right now, and you can see it when marketing says, "Hey, this is our ROAS," and finance says, "But how does that actually tie to the P&L?" And just different languages almost that are tricky to bridge. And so I think working to come to common definitions and understandings of what we mean when we talk about certain things really helps. Bringing those processes and the way we think about our businesses into harmony makes it more efficient. So it definitely is a balancing act, but I think it's work well spent because it makes our organization better because we're all operating and working toward the same goal.
FP&A Today is brought to you by DataRails, the world's #1 FP&A solution. DataRails is the artificial intelligence-powered financial planning and analysis platform built for Excel users. That's right, you can stay in Excel. But instead of facing hell for every budget, month-end close, or forecast, you can enjoy a paradise of data consolidation, advanced visualization, reporting, and AI capabilities. Plus game-changing insights giving you instant answers and your story created in seconds. Find out why more than 1,000 finance teams use DataRails to uncover their company's real story. Don't replace Excel, embrace Excel. Learn more at datarails.com. Thinking about what you're doing at Rad Power Bikes, and this is all the CFOs that I talked to, really anyone in finance, anyone who's having to forecast right now, and this goes back to the COVID days too, but now we have uncertainty around tariffs. We have global supply constraints, or what's going to go on with supply chain if there's a trade war going on, or just the supply chain problems that I feel like we still haven't recovered from since COVID. And then so all the pricing shifts associated with that's all part of your world every day. And now you're looking at it not just from the finance perspective, but you've got to source parts for manufacturing. You've got to handle the marketing around that. So how do you build the financial flexibility into your forecasting models. And I know probably when you were doing the 25 forecast, you weren't planning on this much sort of uncertainty. No, who was, right? No one had that crystal ball. So how are you now trying to stay ahead of these challenges and trying to, kind of pivot and move with them?
Yeah, the common joke is version, XLS dot final. We're into like 65 or 70 finals now at this point. A lot of rework, a lot of reassessing. It's obviously a very timely question. The entire economy is grappling with this, and I always say that there's no word in the English language more scary to a finance professional than the word uncertainty, because that just makes it hard to forecast, hard to plan, hard to allocate resources. And so, with tariffs in particular, I go back to kind of a mental model I've developed over time, which is, within supply chain, this trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. And if you think about the most efficient model of supply chain you could possibly imagine, think of like a single source supplier. They produce all your products. You only have a couple SKUs, and they produce in big, huge batches. They run night and day, no changeovers on the production line. That's maximizing efficiency. But we know that the real world needs more flexibility than that. Your demand doesn't come in those big, huge chunks where all your product is coming in at once. You got to space it out. We have cash constraints. So we trade off that efficiency for flexibility so that we can use just-in-time sourcing and things like that. I would say in times of uncertainty, this is even more important to understand that trade-off, and just know that flexibility is what we have to lean into in times like this. And so if I think about that from a operations perspective, it's, how quickly can you source new suppliers and ramp up production if you have to shift to a new country, for example? How robust are your quality control processes to where you can pivot on a dime? How nimble can you be in regards to your pricing and your pricing adjustments? And then specific to your question on FP&A leaders, how flexible are your forecast models? We go back to those different drivers. We're not necessarily used to having to say tariff could be anywhere from 10% to 150 plus. But you really got to think about that piece as you got to be able to be flexible. If you can't, you won't survive. And I also think about, obviously scenario planning and sensitivity analysis. That's going to become also extremely important. Is what if tariffs are 10%? What if tariffs are 40%? What if tariffs are 100%? Being able to answer those questions, because that's the other thing to think about is FP&A folks, we're obviously tasked with forecasting, but we're also tasked with communicating the forecast and aligning an organization and all the different stakeholders around that forecast, and making sure that people are aware of and bought into the approach. And so that's also key, is you got to manage expectations and questions from the board, your employee base, your customers. So it's not only what are we forecasting and what is the model throwing out at these different sensitivities, but then how do we actually talk about what that means and what the risks are, what the opportunities are. It's not for the faint of heart right now, for sure. And if you're in the trenches with me, I salute you.
I was just thinking about one of my favorite tricks to do when doing forecasts in a time of uncertainty. Like for me, the biggest in my career, the biggest time of uncertainty was the global financial crisis. I was in a pretty leveraged brick and mortar retail business that, it was wild. And so I started on all my forecasts, and we, go back and redo the forecast every quarter. And I started adding the confidence interval bands, and I would look at like at the beginnings of it, I would have, they'd be a fairly tight band, but by the end it was basically just covering the whole graph. It's like, I don't know, it's going to be somewhere. I think it's going to be here, but it's going to be somewhere in this range. Yeah. And then it feels like that's where we are now too. And again, going back to seeing it from all perspectives, this is what the best finance partners are able to do. Is they're not just seeing the numbers, they understand what the numbers mean. And this is something for our listeners who are early in your career. I can remember the first time I was putting together models, or even doing basic reporting, the numbers didn't mean. It was a big telecom company, and the numbers were just big numbers. That really, that scale didn't resonate with me. It looked like seeing the individual trees and not the forest, and so you don't have that insight. But the longer you're around business, the more you can be exposed. And I love the way people are doing business partnering now to really get, like you said, to be, if you're at the facility where the work is happening and you're not just in this kind of finance ivory tower, that's helping you learn the business more. And I was talking to, as I do, talk to FP&A people all day, talking to someone the other day, and they had mentioned a mistake they made early in their career where they were just sending out the daily sales numbers and didn't really mean anything to them. They just pulled the report, slapped them together and sent them out. And ran into the CEO, and who told him, those are some pretty interesting sales numbers you sent out this morning. And he, didn't know what to say about it and had to go back and look at them. And he saw that one area that's a fraction of the size of the other he'd reported 10x the sales in one day of the other. And just, it didn't mean anything to him. So I think that example is kind of why understanding the business and the nature of it and sort of the relativity of it is all so important. And going back to you as that generalist and thinking about that broader knowledge and how it applies to FP&A, but being that generalist in finance clothing, what does that mean to you, and how has that mindset shaped your approach to FP&A?
Yes, we're finance professionals. We're all happy in Excel. I always say I think in terms of rows and columns. I think as if I'm looking at an Excel spreadsheet. To your point, I think that we're at our best when we have the business understanding that then puts those numbers in context for us, and we have much better insights because we know what's understanding of the business. I always talk about knowing the business cold. That's a phrase that I learned at PepsiCo as well. Is it's not enough to just know the numbers. You have to know the business as well. And a key thing that has worked for me is closing the laptop and going to visit one of our retail stores, or going out and seeing our 3PL in action and talking to people that are picking, packing, and shipping the product. Seeing it gives me so much more context than when I go back and look at the numbers, because I do sit in Excel a lot. I have that context, and I interpret the data differently as I'm close to the business operations. So I'm a big believer in that.
Yeah. And another thing that I know you're a big believer in is training and mentoring. And I think when we had our pre-call before the show, that was the first thing I caught on to, because when I looked at your LinkedIn, I think it's in the first sentence in your bio, talks about developing your team. And I think that's hard. That doesn't come naturally to a lot of us, especially people in finance and accounting, because we're sort of drawn to it the way an engineer is. We like being heads down in our models and doing that work. So the soft skills of management and mentoring can be hard. So I'm wondering, as someone who is passionate about that, how do you personally approach developing and mentoring your FP&A team, especially given your background in Honeywell's leadership development program? And I don't know if that was a significant contributor to the way you approach mentoring now or not.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And I think back to early on in my career, I mentioned both Honeywell and PepsiCo, known as gold standard as far as developing finance leaders. And I definitely gained a ton from those early career opportunities. I would say there was a lot that was programmatic about that, the company itself and the structure and the processes that made that happen naturally. But I think I was uniquely blessed and benefited from individual mentors who truly cared about me and my development. And it is a conscious investment. And that's when I think about it, it doesn't come naturally. It takes time, it takes energy, but it's time well spent, and it's a good investment. We talk all the time about, what's your ROI in finance? The ROI on people development is really, really good. And I think, at times that the hesitancy is sometimes it's easier to just do it ourselves than coaching someone and training them to do it. But when they do it and they learn that new skill, that becomes more leverage for you and your team, that now you can rely on them, and that opens up your own capacity a little bit more in the future, and that compounds over time. But secondly, I think the process itself and seeing others accomplish new things and grow in their careers and confidence is rewarding in and of itself. So that's kind of what has kept me focused on that as I've grown my career. It's a little bit of giving back to those early experiences and early mentors that have helped shape me and passing it forward. But it's also, it's rewarding to see others grow and gain that confidence.
For listeners who haven't been through kind of one of those structured leadership programs, what advice would you have for becoming a more effective manager and mentor?
Ooh, yeah, good question. I think there are plenty of examples outside the professional sphere. Think about great mentors you've had in your life, outside of your boss, even parents, athletic coaches, teachers, anyone who has prioritized your success. I think that's really the key of what makes an effective manager and mentor is someone who prioritizes another individual's success. Sometimes it really is just as simple as caring about someone and choosing to see what they can become. And you don't need a HR-driven development plan to do that. You just start to become an advocate for them and look for opportunities for them to stretch themselves and grow and offer those up and help coach them through those opportunities. And I would say if that doesn't come naturally to you, just practice it. It's just like any other skill. Mentorship and helping others grow and develop is something that you get better at as you do it. And so dedicate the time, set up those one-on-ones, set up those coaching opportunities. And over time, that discomfort or maybe the apathy gives way to, hey, this is really exciting to see them develop and grow their skills.
The other part, or the other side of that coin, I guess I could say, is how you're putting into yourself and expanding your career and knowledge. And it's really, both of those are very hard to think about. Sometimes it's, how am I going to build my team? How am I going to build my own skill set? Because it's, especially sometimes you get to a certain point in your career and it's, you think, well, I can do my job. I'm very efficient at it. This is kind of my sweet spot. Why do I need to do anything else? But I think the best leaders are the ones who are continuously learning, continuously expanding, and finding those points of discomfort and going past it. So for you, beyond the training and development of your team, what's top of mind for your career development right now? Or is there something you're trying to learn, explore, or get better at?
Yeah. It's interesting. I just read this morning, someone made a comment about why do so many successful people continue working when they could retire? And somebody commented it's because of the type of person that they are that leads them to the success in that first place, causes them to want to have that drive to continually be improving and learning and growing. So I think that may or may not come naturally to everyone, but I think for those of us who probably, if you're listening to this podcast, you tend to be wanting to be on the cutting edge and learning more. So right now I've recently stepped into an expanded role at the company where I'm now taking on responsibility for marketing. And I would say top of mind for me is learning the world of performance marketing. I definitely have had some exposure to it throughout my career. I majored in marketing during my MBA program, and I've worked pretty closely with marketing leaders for quite some time. But it's kind of the first time in the driver's seat, if you will, and having to actually make the decisions rather than advising on decisions. And so definitely in trying to learn more about both the art and the science of marketing. I think sometimes as finance people, if there's a function that we have historically looked down upon, it may be marketing just because maybe it's more fluff, or maybe it's too creative for us spreadsheet livers, But I really have come to appreciate over time how marketing and finance actually aren't that different. If you think about what a marketing role is, it's making a series of investments in the form of ads or social media posts that are intended to generate a future return in the form of revenue. And if I think about it from my finance mindset in that way, it makes a lot more sense to me. And it gives me an appreciation for the value of the function of marketing in and of itself, as well as how I can plug into it and have some expertise to bring to the table. But it's a lot of learning. I mean, you think about multi-touch attribution models. How do all these different activities that we're doing as a marketing function actually result in revenue? I talked earlier about how does this tie back to the P&L is always the age old question. I think coming to an appreciation of how that's done and how that's measured is really top of mind for me. And that's where I'm leaning a lot of my team and just extra opportunities to learn along the way.
You mentioned your MBA, and I think that coming out of a good MBA program, that really helps if you're going to be that more of a generalist because you're getting the broad picture. And I think a lot of our listeners, maybe undergrad in finance or accounting, a lot of our listeners are probably considering going back for their MBA, and a lot of our listeners already have their MBA. But I'm wondering for you, what went into your decision to attend Kellogg, and what did you get out of the experience, and what advice would you give to our listeners about that?
Yeah, I'd start off by saying I'm a huge believer in the power of education. I think a lot of people approach the MBA decision in particular as a strictly financial decision, right? Like it costs this much. There's some sticker shock when you look at tuition rates, especially for top MBA programs. Um, and so the question becomes, hey, am I going to make that up in my career? Because oftentimes I'm giving up wages for those 2 years while I'm at school. Obviously have the cost itself of attendance, but then the assumption is that over time, the compounding effect of that increased salary post MBA pays off. I definitely wouldn't discourage people from thinking about it that way. I definitely pulled out my own spreadsheet and did that analysis for myself, and that is an important part of the decision. But I would also emphasize there are benefits to education that are not quantifiable, that don't show up on a spreadsheet, that I think are really important to consider as well. My time at Kellogg was extremely personally enriching. I would say, and I often say, my time at Kellogg made me a better me. I just think that the leadership learnings, the personal growth, I've always said as well that, the process of learning makes you a better learner. It's not just you're not just getting those facts put in your head, because those facts eventually will fade away, but it makes you a better learner. What I came to appreciate most from my MBA program was the idea of learning from peers. I feel like I learned as much from my peers, if not more, than I did from my professors. So you think about an MBA environment, especially a full-time MBA program like the one I attended, it's people from diverse backgrounds all over the world in many cases that have done consulting or M&A or even non-business things pre-business school. So just that environment of learning is really, really valuable. And I would say that I've carried with me as I've maintained many of those relationships. We support each other on career transitions, life transitions. And I think just those relationships and that ability to kind of think of my life as a process of lifelong learning is as valuable as anything I learned in the classroom. And so I'm a huge proponent of it. Everyone obviously makes their own decision on it, but nothing but good things to say about that experience and who it has helped me become as a leader and as a person.
Yeah, I think another part of it is what I was alluding to earlier, where people can get sedentary and complacent where they are in their career. And I think a lot about brain plasticity. And I think about the way we do something over and over, and we just have these ruts sort of dug into our neural pathways of just, this is the way it's always done. And it's very hard to be able to shift when you're facing something like the uncertainty that's going on around the economy and just really the kind of thought that you need to be able to bring to the table if you're going to be in a senior leadership, a more of a strategic role. So very important to continue learning. And like you said, the facts kind of go away, but the learning to learn and I think opening up to new knowledge, especially if you have to push yourself for it. If you're not the strongest whatever statistics person and you've taken another statistics class, it's really making you think outside the box and think through that. So I think continuing education beyond the MBA to even is always helpful, especially as we prepare for a future where I think we're going to all get replaced by bots. I don't know if it's just agents. We're going to be managing teams of agents, or I say tongue in cheek. I don't, if you're a regular listener to the show, I'm always rambling on about how cool AI is and all that. But we talked about that actually before the show a little bit, and you mentioned that you're not trying to go beyond the bleeding edge of AI. You haven't fully adopted it yet. And I'm wondering, what's driving that hesitation? Have there been any obstacles, and what would make it more compelling for you to say, okay, well, let's give this a shot?
Yeah, I definitely have listened to the show enough to know that the AI question was coming from you, Glenn. But yeah, I think I would say I do feel like I'm a little bit on the slow track to adoption right now, relative to what I know is out there. I definitely am dabbling in the idea of it. I would say, I'm not I'm not putting my forecast into AI and having it generate it for me. And I certainly don't know that that's the best option anyway. But I would say I have started to use tools here and there. The Gemini meeting transcription tool I've become a big fan of that. So I'm not a complete Neanderthal, but I would say, there are real obstacles that I myself have faced, and I've heard from others as well. I think two that have jumped out to me recently are, the concept of data privacy. I'm at a startup where we don't have, a huge enterprise data security team that tells us these are tools you can use and this is how you use it. And so there is kind of that trepidation of, hey, are these tools I'm using safe? Like, what can I plug in? What shouldn't I plug in? And or which models or which versions of those models are truly safe when we think about data security. That's been an obstacle. I think the second is just kind of that idea of what I can do is good enough. And there's also a learning curve. And so it's kind of upfront cost of, I'm not really sure how I can get this to work for me. It takes more time to learn how to use it in AI as it does to just do it on my own. Kind of going back to that comment earlier about people development. I think applying my own logic against myself, it's probably, make that investment up front to figure out how it's going to benefit you. And then the benefits really start trickling in. And again, those compound over time. But really curious to hear your take on some of those, because I know you're kind of an advocate for this.
Yeah, and I don't want to be to the point where I'm proselytizing about it. It's I guess a couple of things I would say. One, you mentioned Gemini. So within the last couple of weeks, and it's still it's nascent and not. It reminds me. I'm old, so I'm going to do an old reference here. It reminds me of the early days of like AOL and Prodigy, when they would send you a disk in the mail and you'd put it in your computer and you'd install the software and you would try to log on to the internet. And sometimes you would get on and you'd be off fighting with people in chat rooms in 30 seconds and having the time of your life. Sometimes it would just, the modem would screech at you. I won't make the sounds into the microphone, but the modem would screech at you for 3 to 5 minutes and you'd never connect. And we're sort of there with AI right now. And as finance people, there are some things that there's gray area. And if you are off beat a little bit, you're not losing much. But in accounting and in finance, the risk of having a tool or an employee that hallucinates can be a bit of a problem. So I'm not saying we should hand over everything to the bots right now, but with the pace of change, how quickly this is coming, I think that it's time we need to start experimenting with it and understanding it. So even if that means I'm not ready to put my own company data in, but let me play around with some public company data or some, synthetic data or whatever, and see what these models can do. I've seen how they work with words, but what happens when they write code and they can do complex forecasting techniques using auto-regressive integrated moving average and putting seasonality in and letting you do scenario analysis on the fly with the model, not because the model's using its knowledge base that it was trained on, but because it's actually going and writing Python code and building a really cool model under the hood and giving you instant feedback on something that would take you a couple hours to model. So I think that when people start saying, oh, wow, you can use this for numbers and it does have these, but there's also the part where generative means it's generating new novel content every time. So reproducibility, when you talk to the chatbot one time and it tells you one thing, and then you talk to it later and it tells you something different, that's a problem. That's like having a schizophrenic employee, I think. So definitely still some ways to go there before we take it for granted that it's right, and we're definitely in the trust but verify. And I guess I do want to say one thing about data privacy. Now that said, I in my day job, I have clients and we handle their data, and we have uh, data policies around what we can do with it. We have a closed OpenAI enterprise account where all of our data stays within our environment. So there's a couple of things on that. So even if you're not in this enterprise account, all the models now, it's not like when they first rolled out. Claude default, not going to train on your data. I think Gemini maybe default, but they all have settings where you could, everyone from Perplexity, ChatGPT, Gemini, they all have settings where you can say, don't train on my data. So the trust issue is I'm uploading data to the cloud. But if you're using AWS, if you're using Google, if you're using Microsoft and emailing things, it's already in the cloud. So unless you're in a Faraday cage, there is some level of exposure to your data. The question is, well, do I trust Amazon security or Microsoft security or whatever? And if the answer there is no, then you need to look at your whole kind of
Yeah.
tech stack and where
Got to
any
reassess everything
tools
at
you're
that point.
using. Yeah, yeah. So, and then the last thing I'll say on it, large language models, when they're trained, they learn probabilities, not facts. So if I type Michael Jordan is and then hit enter, let it do its job where it does the autocomplete, 999 times out of 1,000, it's going to say basketball player. One time out of 1,000, it might say baseball player. You know, just because it's learning the probability. And most likely, if you're talking about Michael Jordan, you're going to be talking about him as a basketball player. But if you type Glenn Hopper is a blank, it doesn't know who I am. So it may hallucinate something right there. So if I went in to ChatGPT and typed, I am Glenn Hopper, this is my address, this is my social security number, hit enter, and that goes up, even if I had all my privacy stuff turned off and it went up into the model. Now it's not non-zero, but the idea that with something that has read the entire internet and doesn't know who I am, and also the fact that there's hundreds of other Glenn Hoppers. There's a musician in Australia named Glenn Hopper, by the way, pretty good. Haven't met him, but there's also a race car driver named Glenn Hopper, but you know what I mean? And for all of us, there's all these different pieces of information. So that to get out there, and because it's not learning facts, it's learning probabilities, the chances of anyone putting the exact series of things in to get that to come out is it's not non-zero, but it is infinitesimal. So anyway, that's my soapbox on that. And I'm not saying go put all your company data in ChatGPT now, but I am saying it's coming fast. And if it's going in, everybody's talking about agents. I have not yet found an agent that I would trust really to do anything for me yet. And I teach classes where I show people how to use them and what they can do, but we're just talking about the potential now. So I think time probably to study it, experiment, play around with it. Time to let it close your books? No,
Yeah.
we're not there yet. So.
Eventually we will get there though, right?
Yep. I think sooner than a lot of people think. And it's even since I started teaching courses on this, I'm having to go update all my old courses because it can do so much more than it could a year ago when I made these courses. So it's pretty cool. We're seeing the potential.
Yeah.
All right. And now that I've rambled on, what were we talking about here?
No, I definitely appreciate that. I learned something from you just barely. So hopefully the rest of the listeners appreciate that as well.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. Well, because I've taken up half the show with my own inane rambling. We are at the part of the show where we need to wrap it up with our couple of personal questions that we ask everyone. So the first one, if you're a regular listener, is what's something that most people don't know about you that we can't see on your LinkedIn or just by Googling you or whatever?
Yeah, I would say for me, it's a love of outdoors. I grew up in Utah. I grew up hiking, camping. If given the opportunity, I will always opt to do something outside. I love sports. I'm coaching my kids' soccer teams. Anytime I'm not crushing it in Excel, I'm trying to get outside and do something active. I'm not really a runner, but I am training right now for my first Ragnar. So I do that to stay active. I play some ultimate frisbee on the weekends. That's kind of both a competitive and social activity that I get involved in. So really, again, just anytime I can get up in the mountains or get outside and throw a frisbee around, I'm always happy to do that.
And you mentioned before the show that you grew up in Utah, which is uh, the most beautiful state. I mean, the outdoor, the parks there and everything. We've taken the kids out; they're all grown and gone now. But when they were in the house, we went out there multiple times. Just so many great places. So I'm sure hiking and everything you can do in Utah is still a good
I was
part of it.
privileged to grow up there. It's a wonderful place.
Yeah. Okay. Now everybody's favorite question, and you know this is coming, and I hope you have a good answer. I heard a pretty good one the other day. Well, I don't know why I'm rambling so much today. Maybe I always do. I don't know. Let's get to you, our guest, and what is your favorite Excel function and why?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love this question. I always love to hear everyone else's answers. I don't know that I've heard this one a ton. I really love sum ifs. So a lot of what I'm doing is taking, big data sets and generating a forecast, thinking about like how many of this type of e-bike are we going to sell in this geography and this channel. So taking kind of tabular data and aggregating it in kind of custom aggregations. I love the sum ifs for that because you can really define the set of kind of criteria that I want to sort into this specific table. Makes that really easy. One of the alternatives to that is pivot tables, and I find those to be clunky and hard to format. So I really like the kind of how clean sum ifs is to do that. I tend to use that one quite a bit.
Agreed. I still do love a pivot table, but I know exactly what you mean.
Yep.
Well, Derek, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I guess just last question, how can people get in touch with you to connect and learn more about you and what you're doing and Rad Bikes and all that?
Yeah, definitely the best way to connect is LinkedIn. I'm, Derek Paulson. Feel free to add me, follow me. I also do offer career coaching. So I'm on a platform called Leland. So if you look me up at joinleland.com, I'm kind of really focused on early career, finance undergrads who are looking to navigate their career. Happy to do that as well. So feel free to look me up on LinkedIn or on Leland.
All right, Derek. Well, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks, Glenn. I really appreciate it.